Hello, hello, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Don?
hi, how are you?
Hey, Sarah, how are you? Stephanie? I just want to make sure you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a lot to get through. I'm glad you guys were able to, join. I'm at home right now, and you know, uh, I'm used to Zoom pretty much. So this time I won't be walking around and pacing nervously as I usually do. But I prepared a document for us to go through. So I'm just going to go ahead and share that screen. And we have a couple of questions we're going to go through. So here's what's going on. Um, our last class is November 18th. So that's not this Wednesday, but the next Wednesday. So I'm really thinking about what's in your best interest. What should I cover and how should I cover it so that you really get the best out of the course. And so I thought ethics is so important and also it's so practical. And it's so important because it's so practical that I think it would be in your best interest if I dedicated at least today just to looking at some examples of ethical problems and how theoretical ethics can help us think about these practical issues. So I designed a document to walk us through like four different ethical issues if we have time, and then next class, we'll do nothing but political philosophy. I'll outline the general theories about what the role of government is and how the government power is justified by political scientists. And then we'll spend a little time just kind of relating that to actual, the politics we see around us day to day and some of the contrasts we find between, the conservatives and the liberals, also known as the right and the left. And I thought that would be a lot more meaningful. Ethics is so practical, even more than aesthetics, metaphysics, epistemology. So for me to not give you a taste of how relevant ethics is, I thought it would be doing you a disservice. And then next week, um, Monday, I plan for us to talk about existentialism, the meaning of life, and that'll help you a little bit if you're still writing your paper. And we'll go through some major thinkers on that. They all agree that life is worth living, but the way they arrive at it is different. Some of them it's through God and faith, others it's through beauty and just living a very sensual life and all the pleasures that the natural life and natural world has to offer. And then there's just a couple of varieties available. I'm going to expose you to them. We're going to discuss them in class. And then the last day, next Wednesday, November 18th, that is when we're going to conclude by me sharing some of my research. And that'll be the conclusion of the class. So I thought that it was in your best interest for me to arrange things this way. All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if I can do that here. Okay, I need to open. All right. This is the document we're going to go through. Practical ethics. I've designed it and customized it just for this class. We're at 6:40, so we've got 20, we've got 100, we've got 70 minutes. Is it 70? No. Yeah, we've got 70 minutes. So if we can get through at least 15 minutes on each question, this is really again going to be a kind of like we're not going to try and answer everything, I'm just going to try and raise your consciousness about how deep ethical issues can be, how relevant they are, how they're part of your daily life, and also how they're integrated into our law, our legal system, our criminal law, and how it matters who's on our Supreme Court, it matters who our president is, and it matters who our legislators are in Congress. Because ethics is the kind of thing that once you reach a conclusion, whether on a religious basis or a philosophical basis, now implementation is key because it's practical, right? So remember we talked about ethics. We said this. We said ethics is about a couple of different things. There's different ways you can view it. One is just it's some sort of theoretical system for figuring out right or wrong. And the more comprehensive the system is, the more types of issues it can successfully resolve in a reasonable way, then we might say it's the better theory, right? So utilitarianism, deontology, virtue ethics, those are all candidates for this kind of comprehensive theoretical ethics that solves all ethical issues or at least many ethical issues. Okay, so that's one idea. It tells us what's right and wrong. And then building on that, once you've determined that something is right or wrong, you can further analyze that and break it down into not just what's right or wrong, but literally what sort of um, obligations follow from it being right and what sort of um, prohibitions follow from it being wrong. So if we determine that something is wrong, then that means that it's the kind of thing that should be prohibited. And therefore, if we shift over from a theoretical ethical system to a practical, legal, and political system, then this is the kind of thing that will have laws against it, right? And then if it has laws against it, then it's criminal law. That's criminal law right there. All right. So if it's prohibited, it becomes criminal law. And then if it's mandated, that is, if it's mandatory or it's an obligation, if you have to do it, then failure to do it once again becomes a crime. All right. It either becomes a crime or there are severe consequences. So, like, think about if you are a parent, then it's assumed that you have the duty to care for your child. And if you neglect the child, right? So you have this duty. It's mandatory for you to care for the child. If you fail to do that, then there could be legal consequences. It could go the criminal way, or they could just take away your kids, right? They could say, you know what, you're not fit, you're a drug addict or whatever, you don't have your life together, we're going to take the kid away, all right? So there's things that are permitted, many things are permitted, especially in a liberal democracy. In a democratic republic like ours with a liberal constitution, you want to maximize the amount of liberty. That's what our whole First Amendment is about. In fact, our whole Constitution is about restrictions on the government interfering with our liberty. So if you take that view, then the vast majority of human actions by default are supposed to be permitted. That's the default. We as human beings want as much freedom as possible. And then restrictions on our freedom are only justifiable if the government has a compelling interest in doing so. So, for example, the prevention of harm to others or things like that. So, the default position is permission, but some things are prohibited because they're criminal. They've ethically been determined to be wrong. And then some things are mandatory, like paying taxes, right? And if you fail to pay taxes, I mean, I assume that most people would agree that's an ethical issue as well. But independent of whether or not it's an ethical issue, you will go to jail. So it's definitely a legal issue and a criminal issue. All right. And then the final layer of ethics that we talked about is this idea of flourishing. What is ethics there to do? It's to determine right and wrong. Yes. It's to figure out our prohibitions, our obligations, and our permissions. Yes. But at the highest level, it's literally just there to facilitate our lives, to help us reach our full potential, and to flourish as a species and as individuals. All right. So just keep all that in mind as we dive into these topics. All right. So the first one we're going to look at today is the ethics of survival. Right. Let's just look at these questions and think them through. Is survival in itself something good? We have to start right there, you know? We're natural creatures, we're living creatures. So I assume that for a human being being a type of animal, or at least being an animal in some sense, it's got needs that have to be met, at least for that bare minimum of survival. All right. And we're focusing on the individual now. So an individual human being has a couple of needs that have to be met, basically food, clothing, and shelter, but definitely, in a civilization, sanitation, you know, um, a good economy in which you can support yourself by meaningful work, not being overworked, and also having good working conditions, right? And I hope you see that next class, which is going to be political philosophy, is already, we can see it on the horizon. We can see next class coming up. You know why? Because if there are certain goods that are necessary for survival, and we're going to set up a political system, we're going to set up a republic or a democracy, or establish some sort of nation state using a constitution, then automatically, if we're going to design a system like that, that's going to represent our interests and our best interests, ethics is going to flow directly into political philosophy. You're going to see that next class. You're going to see that, oh, wait, if ethics is all about flourishing, then whoever we put in power, either as our representatives or as our employees, as our agents, whoever's in power, that person needs to be representing our interests. Yes, they've got to survive, so we'll give them a salary, good working conditions, but they need to be advancing our best interests. But this goes to the heart of political philosophy. What is the role of government in society? Is it just neutral? Are people who are in power there to just, be like Brahmins in the caste system? They are their own reason for being there. They don't represent anyone's interests. They don't represent the best interests of society. They rule merely because they're the most powerful, not because they have the best interests of everyone else in mind. Keep these things in the back of your mind as we go through this and as we approach political philosophy next class. If our political system is not helping us to do basic things like survive, and when I say we, I mean everyone, right? If it's not giving us meaningful jobs, if it's not giving us a robust economy, if most people are living paycheck to paycheck, that is barely surviving, right? Then what is all this politics for? What is all this stimulation of the economy for, with interest rates and other ways of manipulating the economy, creating jobs, right? And other aspects of the role of government in society, right? Enforcing those prohibitions, enforcing those obligations, and protecting those permissions that we have. So, is survival good? We got to confront that. Is survival good? I assume we all agree that it's good. Maybe it's the most important thing, but surely quality of life also matters here, right? To merely survive, that, I mean, even a slave can survive technically, right? So if we're going to look at what Aristotle believes politics does, where it creates an environment where we can flourish, where we can thrive, then yeah, we need to be doing much more than surviving. We need to have a robust, flourishing mental and moral and intellectual and spiritual life. All right. So survival, I think most people would agree that it's good. Now, is it an unconditional good? Are there any conditions attached to it? So it's only good under certain conditions, or is it unconditionally good? No matter when or where we have survival going on, is it good? Or is it only good under certain restricted conditions? And this is very important because one big thing that happens because of um, people's perceptions that they need to survive is conflict and war, right? So if we talk about the ethics of war, The ethics of war might be a derivative of the ethics of survival, right? Under certain conditions, resources might get scarce, and two communities, two nations might begin to fight over resources. And that's something we got to think about. If you are forced with the choice of either not surviving or surviving, depending on your being able to beat the competition, to defeat an enemy or something like that, you know, what are our intuitions here? Is survival an unconditional good? So, meaning you are permitted to do whatever you need to do to survive, even if that means annihilating an enemy, annihilating a competitor, annihilating a rival. So, war is permitted, or maybe even encouraged in that case, all right? Number two, are the conditions for survival relevant to its rightness, right? So, um, yeah, maybe fate has it that things have turned out that, yeah, a bunch of communities or tribes or nations are cooperating, and that's exactly what's required in this circumstance. And I think that most people would say, yeah, cooperation is peaceful and it's almost like um, edifying, like it builds character. It's the kind of thing we want to encourage. So cooperation seems to not to be problematic at all. If the condition for your survival is that you have to cooperate with others, that's the kind of thing we want to promote, like altruism, being considerate of others, things like that. Sounds very ethical. But competition gets a little bit tricky because it seems to me that there's this concept of the zero sum game, right? If you're in the type of competition where there has to be a winner and there has to be a loser, and we're talking about stuff like scarcity of resources, scarcity as an economic concept, then it gets tricky, right? Because in a system like ours, guys, our democratic republic with our liberal constitution, as we're going to see next class, a lot of what goes on in our economy and a lot of the excellent performance of our economy comes from raw individualistic competition. If people tell the story of the economic history of the United States and why we're a superpower or the only remaining superpower, they're going to tell a story in which, yeah, a bunch of entrepreneurs and captains of industry, a bunch of Mark Zuckerbergs and, Bill Gateses and Warren Buffett's and Jeff Bezos's, what they did is they entered an environment in which they were completely free to accumulate capital and resources as needed to satisfy some demand in the market. And that freedom to innovate, that freedom to be creative, that freedom to assemble private property in just the way you want it to, so as either to meet an existing demand or create a new demand for people that they didn't know they even wanted, that's going to be the story of America and its greatness. However, there's going to be also a dark side to that competition because typically it's a winner takes all system. So whoever wins that competition for the resources gets to own all the resources as private property. And then the transfer of resources into capital, sorry, not into capital, but into profits, they make huge, huge profits off the labor of others and off of exploiting the consumption and the consumers. And now we're going to get into ethical and political issues, right? Is that fair? Is that kind of environment fair where the winner takes all, where the top 1% own, 50% of the wealth? Is that fair? Is that ethical? Is that good? Is that right? And if it's not right, what are our alternatives, right? Because does this mean capitalism is completely wrong, even though it's quite efficient at allocating resources under certain circumstances in certain markets? Does that mean we abandon it and go to the diametrical opposite, which would be something like cap- communism or some form of socialism? Guys, communism and capitalism are economic systems, but everything is integrated with everything else. There are political considerations there, because you have to enforce private property just as you have to enforce the absence of private property, and that's political and legal. And then, of course, there's the ethical issues too, right? Even if capitalism is the most efficient system for allocating resources, that still doesn't answer the distributional question. Because what if it allocates resources very efficiently, that is, very quickly and very well, but the distribution that results from that is unacceptable, right? Certain people have way more than they could ever consume meaningfully. Of course, they could waste it, but meaningfully consume, that is, to survive and to live uh, a flourishing life, probably doesn't take that much to do those two things. So just bear this in mind. And then finally, are the conditions for survival relevant to its rightness? This issue of success. You know, America is all about success. Everybody worships success. You got to be successful. So here's the thing, guys. What if you have an economy with such a high standard of living, such a high GDP per capita, right? That the only way you can survive in this system is to have exaggerated exponential levels of success. So, what if success becomes one of the conditions for survival? And by success, I literally mean you've got to be, making six figures. You got to be working 60, 70 hours a week. You got to live in a certain part of the city. You got to have a certain social circle. That's what we call a high standard of living. And that's also what, from a socioeconomic point of view, we call quote unquote success, right? So you got to think deeply about this. We talk about the high standard of living in America, which is not true for everyone, certainly, but even for those who do have this high standard of living, um, look at all the energy and conformity, look at all the loss of freedom that comes with that. Because, yeah, a lot of Americans do have a high standard of living, but Americans work. I don't know if you know this, compared to other countries, even in Europe, Americans work a lot. Americans have a very high work ethic, and Americans don't take many breaks. They don't even take most of their holidays most of the time. All right. All right. So for number three, does survival imply reproduction? Right? Does survival imply reproduction? Now we've got to take the individual survival, right? That phenotype and his life cycle, his lifespan. That's one notion of surviving, right? He lives to the ripe old age of 60, 70, or 80, and we say he lived a full life. He survived. What about at the species level, right? Is the species surviving if it doesn't reproduce, or if it doesn't reproduce at least at rates large enough for it to, maintain itself? And this is an issue. This is a very, very sensitive issue because, again, this politics comes in here. Could reproduction become an obligation under certain conditions in order for a dynasty or a tribe or a nation or even a species to survive? Later on, we're going to switch from survival in general to the issue of marriage and sexuality. And this is going to come up again. But like as I'm going to share with you later, there was a Roman emperor, the first Roman emperor known as Augustus Caesar. So after they killed Julius Caesar, Augustus, no, Julius Caesar, okay, during the decline of the Roman Republic, there were many tyrants for short periods of time. They were dictators, but none of them became emperors because it was still a republic and there was still resistance to their long term. Um, yeah, I mean, there was resistance to their long term stay in power. But Julius Caesar came the closest to becoming a tyrant. He was murdered. And then his relative, Augustus Caesar, is the one who successfully transformed the republic into an actual empire and he became the emperor. Now, what we're going to see later is that one of the things that he was struggling with is, I think I've shared this with you in class, the the warrior class in the Roman Republic, the warrior class. was the aristocrats. They were the ones doing most of the fighting, and it was they who had that very noble ethics and that excellence that grew the Roman Empire to its large size. But as he came into power, he noticed that a lot of the young people were just staying bachelors perpetually, having fun, having affairs, and they weren't reproducing. So he was concerned because I think from his perspective, the aristocrats are going to die out if people just keep on, living this frivolous lifestyle, not growing up, not doing their civic duty. And part of the civic duty is marrying and reproducing to maintain the aristocrats. So it's interesting. We're going to talk about that a little bit more, but that's what that question means there. Could reproduction become an obligation, right? Augustus literally, I mean, people were losing their inheritances because they were, playboys for too long. They were bachelors for too long. They were avoiding marriage. And he set up some pretty strict incentives to be married and some disincentives for not marrying. Like you could lose your entire inheritance even though you were an aristocrat. All right. All right. So number four, should we legislate and regulate the institution of marriage as a policy for promoting the survival and flourishing of the species? Guys, this is a sensitive topic because from the ancient perspective, marriage was a lot, quote unquote, colder than it is now. Marriage back then was very much oriented towards solidifying and advancing political interests. And by political, I don't just mean the people ruling in power, but political in the sense of anytime you have an interest, guys, if you have an interest in something, that's a kind of political environment you're in. So whether it's roommates or classmates, anytime you have competing interests that could either align or conflict, you have a political environment. And there's some power to be managed and balanced there. So here's what's going on is that for most of human history, marriage was not a very romantic affair. It was very business oriented. You married to advance interests. You married to make alliances. You married to increase your wealth, your net worth. You married to create children to continue your legacy. You married so that you would have enough people to enter your military to defend your country, that kind of thing. Very pragmatic, very sober, But starting in the late 1700s, and at least in the West, romantic ideas of relationships started to proliferate. And then marriage slowly became an optional institution, for one, and two, the type of institution that was motivated by happiness and bliss and love rather than solid, pragmatic interests. So, what happens when people start putting these pathetic, quote unquote, feelings above truly ethical ones, and they do it at such a large rate that you start having declines in population? Should the government be able to come in and say, look, you have to get married? You have a duty to get married. You have an obligation which failure to meet will lead to severe disincentives or maybe even criminal. Okay? So it's something to think about. As we look at somewhere like Europe, for example, there are parts of Europe, like Italy, where people are just not reproducing very much. Not only are people not getting married, they're just not reproducing. So could it be unethical not to reproduce? That's something to think about. What about activities that go beyond survival, right? So you're consuming a whole bunch of stuff that you don't need, or you're not even consuming it. You just have it sitting in a bank account, financial capital. We have a bunch of resources that could be feeding a whole bunch of other people, but you're just holding on to it. You could never consume it yourself. None of your children or your children's children could ever consume it all, right? So you live a life of leisure and luxury and unnecessary consumption. Of what's the ethics of lives that go beyond mere surviving? Lives that are now not just flourishing, but almost either wasting or just being idle, like resources are now idle. Should the wealth, what is the ethics of these activities that are not survival based anymore? No. Should the wealthy have a duty to redistribute their wealth to those who actually need it to actually survive, both at the necessary level and a little bit of flourishing, you know? Should the wealth of those who are beyond mere survival be redistributed to facilitate the survival of those who are in danger of not surviving? And here we got two ideas going on, right? We got the hereditary story of someone who inherits a whole bunch of money that he can't spend, and that has a very different ethical feel than someone who worked hard, is a self-made man, started from nothing, and then through this tremendous effort and this tremendous skill and this tremendous genius in manipulating the market and accumulating resources, they become a billionaire, you know, but they worked hard for it. That's the thing. So the analysis of this gets interesting because if someone just inherits money, then we can always say, yeah, we're going to give you an inheritance tax and we're going to take half of it. One, because you didn't work for it, and two, you have more than enough than you can consume, and three, there's a shared infrastructure in the country you live in that you need to give back to, and we're going to do a progressive tax since you own more and you can afford to give more. Well, we're going to redistribute more. You know, this is a lot deep stuff because again, I'm sure you can see how this gets into politics immediately, right? Those who have a lot of wealth, either by inheritance or by being self made entrepreneurs, they're going to defend it however much they can. And they're going to be against inheritance taxes. They're going to be against capital gains taxes. They're going to be against taxing the wealthy, you know? And then economic theory is going to come in, right? Some are going to argue, yeah, you shouldn't tax us not because we're greedy. You shouldn't tax us because we're the ones who make all the jobs, right? We're the job creators. We hire everybody else. All right. So things get really intertwined and entangled. Ethics, politics, economics. All right. All right. So, and then we got the utilitarian and deontological and virtue ethical analyses. You know, all of these are different ways of framing the issue, right? Is it a virtue to survive? Can we talk about survival as a virtue? Right? We've got all sorts of virtues like courage, wisdom, self control, faith, hope, love. But it would be interesting if we had all those fancy virtues and yet the basic virtue of survival, we didn't appreciate it. And then look at deontology, right? Clearly one is going to have a duty to survive. I don't see how you can have all these other duties when the other duties depend on this more basic duty of just surviving. But again, remember what I told you. What is involved in that? Conflict, war, competition. Are you allowed to kill in order to survive? Right? Is that acceptable? And then utilitarian, um, if you're going to do what's for the greater good, right? If you're going to make the argument that we need to put the common good above individual good, right? We need to do what is in everyone's best interest and make as many people as happy as possible. If that's your criterion, then it has implications for how we should not only make wealth, but also how we should redistribute that wealth, you know? All right. Another institution related to survival is a punishment. So we have to reach a very interesting question here. The ethics of punishment. Is punishment ethical? And under what conditions is punishment ethical? And the first question to really introduce that is punishment necessary for survival? If we failed to punish, would we be in danger of failing to survive? Right? We have a large criminal justice system, very large. And the threats to civil society that lead us to imprison all these people are various. Some of it is stuff like domestic violence, right? A husband beating his wife. If we don't arrest him now, it won't be long before she's probably going to be dead, you know? Um, Take drugs, for instance, right? if we have drug dealers in our communities, and especially given the type of drug, those really um, controlled substances like heroin, you can see someone decline from a crystal meth or a heroin addiction very quickly. You know, so all I'm saying is, and then we got stuff like prostitution. We've got all sorts of vices that could break down our survival in the long term. So all I'm saying is, if you consider the possibility that punishment might be necessary for survival, then that might open you up more to some of these justifications for punishment that we're going to go through. All right. So some of the main justifications for punishment are based on the idea that if you do a philosophy of the law, what is law? Well, one way to model the law is on criminal law, right? You say all law essentially is like criminal law. Now, that's not exactly right, right? Because the laws determining the process of becoming married, I mean, that's clearly not, that's just not, it's not criminal law. It's not even analogous to criminal law. It's a bunch of procedures you follow in order for the state to consider you married and to enforce the marriage, right? So this criminal law model of all law, it has its limitations, but there is a key insight, at least into the criminal law, right? Because what is criminal law? Well, there was one philosopher of law called H.L.A. Hart. He said, you know, if you model all law on criminal law, then what you're basically saying is a law is something in which you have a threat that's backed by violence, right? So if you have a law saying you should not kill or whatever, what you're doing is you're saying, look, you're threatening people in general. You're saying, look, don't do this. And if you do this, I will be violent towards you. It could be as much as just arresting you for a short period of time, and it could even lead to the death penalty, right? All right. So the justifications for punishment, retribution. Retribution, guys, is nothing other than revenge. You are saying, when you punish someone from retribution, you are saying that person deserves to be punished because of what he did to someone else. It's basically an eye for an eye, right? He deserves to be punished because of what he did to someone else, and he deserves to be punished to the same degree that he did something to someone else. That's what you're saying. And guys, I mean, maybe this is part of human nature. Maybe revenge is such a deep part of our psychology that if we tried to eliminate criminal law completely or eliminate capital punishment and things like that, who knows? Maybe the mental health of victims and victims' families would deteriorate if they saw that they themselves were not allowed to practice revenge, and then they also saw that the government didn't take any step to practice revenge. Then you would have one of two things happening. You would have either people taking up revenge on their own, and you really don't want that, because once it goes outside this criminal justice system, then you'll have like mafia activity. You'll have people eliminating each other and engaging in cycles of violence that never end. He killed my brother, so I killed his sister, so he killed me, my mom, and back and forth, back and forth. So retribution is very deep in the human culture and human psyche. It's a very deep part of us. Some of our religions encourage us to be above it, like Christianity, obviously. But I don't know, man. Maybe it's too idealistic and too visionary to think that you could ever get beyond something as basic as retribution. Some philosophers say, look, retribution shows respect not only for the victim and the victim's family, right? But it's showing respect for life, right? By punishing someone who does something wrong, you are saying we as a society respect the person who was harmed so much that we're sending out a symbol that we don't tolerate that, we don't appreciate that. All right. And that's why we have punishment, is for retribution. But a lot of people are against retribution too, not only for the religious reason that we should forgive, but also because once the damage is done, The retribution only increases the negativity. It increases the pain. It increases the suffering. And that doesn't do any good either. If you have one victim's family demanding justice and they get that justice on the guillotine or on the death penalty, now we have another new family that is distraught, right? All right, guys. So specific deterrence. Deterrence is the idea that, hey, we don't punish because the person deserves it. And we don't punish it for his sake directly. We punish it because of we don't want him or anyone else to do it again. And that process of making someone not do it again is called to deter them. That's why it's called deterrence. So when it's specifically deterring that person from doing it again, it's called specific deterrence. It's specific to that person. And then general deterrence is you punish that person not just for him not to do it, but to send a message so that no one will do it again. And guys, the reason I put these two first, these three first, one, two, three, is because these are the most basic and most common justifications for punishment. Now, the deterrence one is interesting because it's empirical and data oriented in a way that retribution isn't. In other words, if you make the claim that I'm punishing this person because it's going to send a message, well, that's empirical. That's the kind of thing you can collect data on, and you can really, okay, you can ask the question, how many people actually avoid doing particular actions because they know someone who got punished for it, or because they know there is a penalty for it? Some of the studies I've come across, especially in law school, suggest that it's not very convincing that people actually avoid crimes specifically having in mind avoiding um, certain punishments. The link is rather weak. That's all I'm saying. All right, number four, incapacitation, right? So, incapacitation is the kind of thing that if a police officer arrives early on a scene and can de escalate um, what's going on, then they can avoid punishment in general, right? In theory, that's what we would want to happen, de escalation, and nothing happens. But if that person that is being arrested is a threat to himself or someone else, then the first priority of the police officer who's arriving on the scene is not retribution or deterrence. No, it's incapacitation. That person is a threat to himself or someone else. So if the police officer pulls out a taser or a gun or whatever, he wants to incapacitate that person, to take away their capacity to hurt anyone else or themselves. All right. So I think that's pretty self explanatory. Denunciation is the idea that there are certain things that are so obnoxious and so unacceptable that we come together as a society and send a symbolic message that this is unacceptable in our society. So we punish kind of like to affirm our values and to denounce values that are expressed that we don't tolerate. And then the sixth one is an interesting one, rehabilitation, guys. To rehabilitate someone, you could classify that as a kind of punishment. And what you're doing here is you're punishing them, quote unquote, but to educate them, to reform them, to 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 treat them like a patient, almost like a mental health case, and then restore them back to being a good citizen. And this is very controversial for many reasons. One, what about the damage they did on a retribution level? Two, what about the deterrence message that I'll be sending? It would be like, hey, there are no consequences for bad behavior. And then three, obviously, lots of resources going to rehabilitate people who may or may not actually reform. That's controversial, where the taxpayers would want all their money going to that, you know? But on the other side, in the Scandinavian countries like Norway and other countries, their model of criminal justice is very rehabilitation oriented. Like, for example, in Norway, regardless of whatever you do as a criminal, it could even be terrorist activity. You can't get more than 23 years in prison, you know? So they're trying to get you out. Their end goal is to get you out of the system, not to kill you and not to keep you forever. They're going to work with you and get you out and restore you. And that's rehabilitation. All right. So just to go deeper into this, we've got argument against the death penalty, right? We're going to take a specific case of punishment and just go a bit deeper. What is one big argument against the death penalty, which is also known as capital punishment? Well, one author, his name is um, Nathanson, he argues basically that the symbolism of abolishing the death penalty is very powerful. When the nation adopts a stance, it's like erecting a monument, right? You're saying, we stand for the abolition of life, no, sorry, the abolition of the death penalty because we affirm the value of life. So that's what the symbolism would be sending, right? If a nation symbolically says, we are not the type of country that has a death row, we're not the kind of country that executes people, then first you would be sending the message that all life has unconditional value. Just because you're a criminal, just because you made a mistake, even if you killed someone, we still recognize your life as being so sacred, so precious, that it has unconditional value. And in the long run, guys, this is very aspirational. Maybe we're not mature enough to live like this now. But if we talk about a utopia, this is the kind of utopia we would want. Maybe in a utopia, people are completely perfect. Maybe that's one kind of utopia. But another kind of utopia is where people do make mistakes, they have flaws, but the response to those mistakes is rehabilitative, nurturing, patient, caring, that kind of thing. And then, secondly, if you got rid of the death penalty, you would be sending a message of commitment to restraint in the use of violence. So not only are you saying that life is sacred, but you're also saying nonviolence or pacifism or being peaceful is a cardinal value. It's a supreme value. This doesn't mean that you never kill. It just means you don't punish. You don't do capital punishment, but it doesn't mean you never kill. So if a police officer arrives on the scene and has to execute someone either to defend themselves or defend someone else, then that's still permissible under this framework, you know? And abolitionism, guys, just to give you some perspective, a lot of the biggest nations in the world and the superpowers like China, Russia, and the United States, they still have the death penalty. But almost all over Europe, Western and Eastern and Central Europe, every member of the EU has abolished the death penalty, every single one. Right? So some would call that progress and being humanitarian and humanism. Others would say that's backward. For those who say it's backward, though, a lot of the studies show that places like Norway and others, where they have this rehabilitative approach, the level of crime goes down significantly. In fact, in Norway, the level of crime has gone down so much that I saw a documentary about how in Sweden and other Scandinavian countries, Norway was like, "Hey, man, we got empty prisons over here. If you got some people you can send our way, we'll rent it out to you at a cheap rate." You know, like there's evidence, empirical evidence that rehabilitative and humanitarian approaches to criminality yield better results in the future in terms of the incidence of crime in general. All right, the ethics of marriage and sexuality. Oh yeah, before we get there, of course, you can always look at these through the lenses of the utilitarian, the ontological, virtue ethical, right? So, is punishment in itself virtuous, right? Is it virtuous? The person who punishes, right? Is it virtuous for him to punish? Guys, to the extent that punishment is a kind of educator and it helps people learn, yeah, you could actually think of it as virtuous, right? A teacher who punishes, I don't know, by taking off points or they used to do beating, corporal punishment. I don't know. All of this is very controversial, but you can see how punishment can be a kind of educational tool. Deontology, right? Do you have a duty to punish? Well, if you can universalize it and see, is this the kind of thing that you think should happen universally in these situations? Something to think about. Yeah. And utilitarian, right? Maybe punishing a little bit now will create an environment in which you maximize happiness in the long run. What is punishment? Increasing pain, right? So at first you might think a utilitarian analysis would say, oh, no, 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 we should never increase pain. Utilitarianism is all about maximizing happiness. But what if the condition for maximizing happiness is do a little bit of punishment so that you educate the person not to do it again. And then also because he's decreased his infliction of suffering on others, now in the long run, you create more happiness, right? All right, the ethics of marriage and sexuality. Once again, guys, this is a controversial issue. Is marriage necessary for survival? And you know, marriage is related to cultural phenomena. I guess marriage is an institution. Marriage is a cultural phenomenon. Marriage, yeah, it's more cultural than natural, I guess. I don't think there are any animals that quote unquote marry. Although there are animals that pair bond. Like I think certain birds stay together for the rest of their lives. But even if it's a cultural phenomenon and not natural, its relationship to survival, like I was telling you earlier about Augustus Caesar, under certain conditions, it can be thought to be necessary for survival, you know, where you have a declining population or the population is aging faster than it's reproducing, right? If you don't have a bunch of young people in the workforce, how are you going to get the taxes to support the social security that's needed for the retirement and pensions of the elderly population, which is getting bigger and bigger exponentially, right? All right, guys. So marriage, if we're going to think about it as a survival issue, then we got to confront this thing called sexuality, right? Because if marriage is related to survival, then it's through sex, it's through reproduction. And if we're going to talk about sex, then we have to talk about a very interesting issue. Is erotic activity, sexual activity, is the erotic more a species of the ethical or the aesthetic or the biological? Or is it all of those at the same time or some combination, right? So if you see erotic activity, if you see a couple necking and making out for hours in a picnic somewhere, is that erotic in the sense that it's aesthetic? Is that beautiful? Is it, you know, I mean, we have so many films, so many novels, so much art is dedicated to love. And if you take love, if you take erotic activity to just be one specimen of love or one expression of love, then maybe it's not really ethical at all. It's just purely aesthetic. It's a matter of beauty and, you know, it's a value, but it's not an ethical value. Something to think about, right? Because, again, since romance has become a lot popular in the modern world, going on a romantic love affair without committing to marriage, that's becoming more and more popular. So, as people look at their life existentially and they say, what makes life worth living? One of the stories they're going to tell is like, yeah, the love affairs I've had, those are the things that made life worth living. But that's not going to be the ethical side of it. That's going to be the aesthetic, the beauty of it. Or is it ethical? Is the erotic literally ethical? That is, regardless of the pleasure involved in reproducing, if you are reproducing if you are reproducing primarily in order to continue your family line, to contribute to the tribe or the nation or the species, is that truly an ethical activity? And getting married, is that also an ethical activity, right? And then the biological, it just turns out that, you know, given the way erotic activity works, there's a certain story you can tell about how certain cells um, interact, sperm hitting an egg, and there's a completely biological story you can tell about the phenotypes that are going to emerge. You know. All right. So an interesting question that comes from this is the sexual side or the erotic side of marriage and sexuality. We have to look at sexuality now. What implications does the necessity of marriage for survival have for the adult entertainment industry? We're talking about mainly prostitution and pornography, right? If if we permit prostitution and pornography, is there any reason to believe that that would cause a threat to marriage? Because we're talking about ethics here, right? Is prostitution unethical? And if we're going to say it's unethical, why? Is it because it's ugly, it's a bad aesthetic? Is it because it's just intrinsically unethical? That is, there's something actually evil or bad about the whole interaction? Maybe because it's a transaction, maybe because it's abusive, exploitative. There's a couple of things we could say. And the same with pornography to the extent that it's an entire industry built around primarily women displaying themselves, voyeurism of sexual activity. But then it gets tricky again, right? Remember, I asked, is the erotic also aesthetic? Many people who defend pornography are going to say, hey, this is art. This is art. And in a country where people have freedom of expression, they should have the right to make whatever art they want. Two people should be free to come together, regardless of if they're paid to come together. They should be able to come together and make whatever art they want. That's what happened in California. I was reviewing the legislation in California. I don't know if you know this, but a lot of porn is made in California. I think especially Northern California. And what I reviewed is the way they decided it is because the California courts treated pornography as free speech. So when two actors enter into a pornographic film, the way the court processes that is that it doesn't matter if they were paid, it doesn't matter, that they're having sex. If you capture that on film or elsewhere, that's that's a way of expressing yourself. So you, the director, are paying people to express your artistic vision, and each of those two individuals are also expressing themselves. And then, of course, the consumption of the product that comes from that, people have the right to consume what they want if it's available in the market and it's not really hurting anyone. But of course, people are going to say, of course, it's hurting people. You are purchasing things that are fueling an industry which is abusive and exploitative. And some porn is very violent, very abusive of women, and not just abusive of them like physically, but demeaning. A lot of feminists would say the way women are portrayed in a lot of porn is just degrading intrinsically to women. All right, and prostitution, obviously, it's unlikely that most prostitutes either want to be there or would be there if they had options or if they thought they had options, right? So we're thinking about prohibition, guys, permission, that kind of thing. If we say that these things are intrinsically evil from a kind of religious perspective, just having lustful thoughts and extramarital activity, that's one basis. But marriage is the other basis too, right? You could say that, yeah, this is a threat to marriage. If you have bachelors, addicted to porn and addicted to prostitution, they might never marry. All right. So, do we have obligations to reproduce? Because that's gonna frame this idea of what kind of institution marriage is. Many people who are conservatives, at least social conservatives on the right, they're gonna say marriage is key. It's the fundamental institution of society because the family is the fundamental sociological unit, right? So we have to protect the family, and that's why there a lot of people on the right, conservatives, are against gay marriage. So what about obligations to marry in order to reproduce? Right? Could we ever say you have a duty? Right? We're going to interrupt your freedom. You can't live your whole life as a bachelor. You can't dedicate your whole life to your career. At some point, whether man or woman, you have to prioritize children. And they need your time and energy and other resources. So you can't live this bachelor lifestyle, single life. What about prohibitions or permissions of extramarital affairs? This is very interesting, right? Because again, a lot of this has a religious flavor to it. But from a purely ethical standpoint, could we say there's something wrong with extramarital affairs? Guys, extramarital affairs extends all the way from fornication, that is two unmarried people, all the way through adultery, that is two married people or one married person and one unmarried person, right? Extramarital affairs are, I mean, how do you how do you prohibit something like that? There are people falling in love all the time, people having crushes, people, meeting on dating apps. Is that the kind of thing you even want or even can regulate, right? And there are certain countries, there are certain cultures where they do regulate that kind of thing. There are cultures where women are not allowed to leave the home without some male relative, either a father, a brother, a son, and it's to kind of protect and enforce that. So, what about legislating morality, making it a crime to stay single or incentivizing marriage, like Augustus here? Something to think about, right? If some president or some politician said, I'm running to restore the family back in the United States, we're going to bring marriage back, and we are going to disincentivize staying single strongly. They could use taxes, they could use other things, right? All right. And is gay marriage a threat to marriage and the family? Right? Gay marriage. Two gay people getting married. Does that threaten the family? Very interesting to think about that, right? What does two gay people coming together, how is that in any way related to the marriage of their neighbors, their straight neighbors? How does it threaten the neighbor's marriage and the neighbor's family? Something to think about, right? How does one thing influence another? How does that even happen? And while we're at it, guys, we're talking about ethics here, but there's a lot of metaphysics here too. When two people take marriage vows, a lot of the religious language and the rhetoric will be like, let what God has put together, no man take apart. This is metaphysics. You're essentially suggesting that man and a woman are more than their bodies. They're kind of like souls, and they're becoming soulmates, and God is forging a metaphysical bond between them. So not only is it unethical for them to divorce, and the Catholic Church and many religious institutions are completely against divorce. Um, so not only is it unethical, but depending on your metaphysics, that bond might be a necessary bond. It can't be changed. So a lot of philosophy inherits a lot of its values and worldviews from religion, as you might have guessed. So when someone says gay marriage is a threat to marriage and the family, they might have in mind something like, okay, once we make this visible and acceptable, then it's like it's going to gain momentum, and more people are going to live the free lifestyle to do whatever they want, and eventually it's just going to corrode and corrode and corrode, and people will stop marrying. People will explore their sexual orientation. Uh, Rates of people being gay will go up, and there'll just be a decrease in marriage and a decrease in reproduction. What about polygamy, right? Polygamy, the ethics of polygamy. Can anyone give a principled, reasoned argument against polygamy? As a Christian or a Jew, I guess you'll quote the Bible, but I'm talking about, let's assume that those are religious prejudices. Can you give a purely rational story about why polygamy is wrong? Again, let's go into utilitarianism. Is there something about it decreasing everyone's happiness? I don't know. Maybe you can tell a story about how the wives the wives in polygamous marriages, you have some evidence that they're typically unhappy, either because of all the jealousy or less resources, or maybe the man is typically domineering. I don't know. Deontology, duty, right? There have been certain points in history when it was actually a duty to marry many women because you needed to help a population rehabilitate itself that was in danger of dying out. I think Paraguay is one place where they engaged in a war against their neighbors, and the men were so decimated that the few men who were left, they had a duty to marry many women and reproduce. And in Islam, you're allowed to marry under certain conditions, many women. All right. And then virtue ethics, I mean, it's interesting. Love seems like, on the one hand, something very spontaneous and pathetic, but as I shared with you last time, it can also be something very ethical, very sober, right? You can get into a marriage knowing that it's not all going to be fun and romantic, and there's going to be a real stoic aspect to it. All right. So this last one is a very controversial one and very relevant to current events. The ethics of abortion. Is a pro life, anti abortion policy necessary for survival? Is it conceivable that once women become very feminist and liberated, they can all decide, you know what, I'm going to do whatever I want with my body. I can prioritize my career. I can just have a bunch of meaningless romances, and I do not have to reproduce. And if I do accidentally start the process of reproduction, I can interrupt it and abort it at any time. So here's one pro choice argument. Here's one argument for why we should be pro choice. So the first one, this is by a philosopher known as Warren. She says we need to define the moral community so we can determine who is in that community and who is out. That is, who has rights. When we're talking about a moral community, we're talking about the community of people who have rights and duties, right? So that typically involves adult persons, right? They have rights and duties. And so anyone who's in the community, like an adult person, will have rights and duties. And then whoever is outside of it won't have as many rights and duties. Like maybe torturing a cow is wrong and you'll get in trouble, but killing a cow for food is not, you know? So the cow doesn't have the same rights that a human being does because you can't kill a human being in order to consume it. All right. And so the concept, the central concept that we need to define the moral community, who's in and who's out, is personhood. It's if we want to figure out who's in the moral community and who has rights, then we need to figure out who's a person and who's not. And genetics is not enough because there's a lot of genetic phenotypes that qualify maybe as some version of human, but they're not actual persons. And we'll get into that in a minute. So here are the criteria for personhood. What makes a person? Well, they've got to be conscious. Now, this is important because if you're not conscious, you're not capable of feeling pleasure or pain. Okay? All right? If you can't even feel pleasure or pain, it's your basis for asserting your right becomes weaker. Right? Reasoning. You know, Aristotle defined the human being or the person as the rational animal. We are animals who are capable of reasoning. So, what's distinctive about us, what defines us in relation to all the other animals, is this capacity to reason. All right. And then self motivation, right? A robot has to be programmed and motivated externally. It doesn't have its own self motivation. But it seems like a person, like a human being, this goes back to the free will thing, right? It seems like human beings have free will. They can motivate themselves, they can determine their own actions. And that's a key part of personhood. Then we got communication, right? The ability to communicate, very, very important. And then finally, self concept and self awareness, the ability to know that you yourself are a certain kind of thing and to know what kind of thing you are. So, her basic argument is that a perfectly well defined person would meet all these criteria, but even if it doesn't meet all of them, then it should at least meet most of them. And so her conclusion, Warren's conclusion, is that what we call fetuses or embryos do not satisfy this criterion and therefore are not persons, right? So a pro choice person is going to say, look, I have no evidence that that small collection of cells is conscious. I certainly don't see any reasoning going on. The motivation that we see in its growth and development seems like chemical laws, like just pure chemistry going on, right? DNA is a very advanced biomolecule, macromolecule. So it seems like biochemistry is going on, but not the kind of free will that we understand. And there's just no reason to believe there's communication going on or self awareness. So again, the fetus would fail this test. All right. And then now we have concluding remarks. Some human beings, according to Warren, are not people. Again, fetuses, they might be in some way be human, especially if you think of them genetically, right? Genetically they might be human, but there's just no reason to believe that they are persons or people. And the same with people in comas, right? Someone who's been in a coma for a year, they've got the respiratory functions and all these automatic reflexes going on that are controlled by the lower brain, like the medulla. But the advanced cerebral brain, the kind of neocortex going on that really involves decision making and personality, that's gone in most people with comas or most people who are what they call in a vegetative state. There's just no brain activity. And so there's no reason to believe that what makes them a person is there, things like consciousness and reasoning. And some people are not human beings. If we meet aliens, one of the things we're going to have to figure out is, okay, this is interesting. Is this the type of alien that's more like a cow that we can eat or do whatever we want with, or use as a for labor, or is this the kind of alien that's like a human being, and we have to respect them with the dignity and the rights of a human being? Or are they something else, kind of like the X-Men, like a mutant or something? And the same with AI. If AI evolves to the point where it's not only intelligent, but we also believe there's a mind there, the problem of other minds is like, wait a minute, this thing is not just intelligent, it's not just mimicking human behavior, but it's actually conscious and sensitive and can feel pain and pleasure. That might revolutionize who we include in the moral community. All right, guys. So this is the final point. Even if the fetus did have rights, let's think through this through carefully. Even if a fetus did have rights, still it seems like its rights cannot defeat those of the mother to control her own body. Why? Guys, think about what we would be doing. Women have been treated like property and secondary citizens throughout much of history. If we were to continue that now, we would be giving them a quote unquote duty to reproduce, right? She got pregnant, accidentally or intentionally, but now she has this duty imposed on her, right? To impose that kind of duty, you're using fancy ethical language like duty, but this is really a kind of slavery and a kind of lack of autonomy, right? I mean, in a liberal constitution, in a democratic society with a liberal constitution like ours, we're liberals in many ways, both on the right and the left. And, just like people on the left, on the right, fight for the right to do whatever they want with their resources and their businesses, they don't want people taxing them, then of course it makes sense that a woman would also say, hey, you know what? This is my body. I don't want the government telling me what to do with my body. So, can the rights let's assume that the metaphysics is on the side of the religious people, right? Let's assume that the soul begins at conception. So there's a metaphysical entity there, and now it has rights. Okay, even if it does have rights, even if we agree with all of that, under what conditions does its rights supersede those of the mother? It's a very interesting question, right? We have this thing that is metaphysical from a religious perspective. It's a soul. The mother has a soul. The rights of this baby, do they compete and conflict with the rights of the mother? And if so, why do we say that it has more right than the mother has right over her own body? And that's why we call them pro choice, right? They're not pro abortion, they're just pro choice, autonomy. My body, I should have the right to do with it what I want. So yeah, if we deny women this right to do what they want with their body, then they're going to become like a dutiful agent or slave for delivering babies. They're probably only going to be valued for that ability, and they're going to have no autonomy and will be dictating things against their own will. All right, guys, any questions? Did it make sense? I mean, there are plenty of ethical issues. I just chose some of them that are very relevant and controversial and contemporary, but so many things are ethical issues, right? Um, all right, so let me take attendance, and then we can go ahead and end. So, okay. So we got Carter, Dante, Guillermo, Sarah, and Stephanie. All right, guys. So anyone wanna say anything or whatever? Any concerns? Any questions? I can't wait to read your existentialism papers, the last ones, to find out who you really are. Nothing. All
I have a
right.
question
Yeah.
about my I sent you an email about the ethical paper. I was just wondering if you got that. I sent it a couple days ago.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, wait. Yeah. Yeah. I didn't reply to you, man.
No. Well, I mean, you did, and then I sent you a follow-up one because I sent it attached. I just wanted to make sure you got it.
Yeah, I got it. You're talking about essay number 3, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I got it, man.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Anyone have anything else? Okay, guys, have a great day, and I look forward to our next class. It's going to be fun. We're going to get into some politics, political philosophy, and just think through some of the basis for our current Democratic and Republican Party dynamic. And it should be a fun discussion. So I'll see you there. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. See
Thank
you
you.
Wednesday.